There was a deep blue, cloudless sky over New York City on the morning of September 11th, 2001. It was a day that started off like any other for most of us, but how many of you remember exactly where you were 10 years ago today? Wow. It's amazing that it's been 10 years. It's just like, and a decade is already gone. And it seems like it just keeps getting faster and faster and faster. On that day that started off like any other became one that was etched forever into the minds and the memories of all of us who watched from whatever location as the towers fell amid these massive clouds of smoke and dust. Because in that moment, everything changed. There's hardly an element of our life today that has not been somewhat affected by the events of that day. And I think back, instantly there was this resurgence in patriotism. And there was a unity across our nation that was unlike anything I have ever experienced in my lifetime. And as we get near this time of elections and all that stuff again, my heart kind of longs for the day when you just shouldered up next to people because you were fellow citizens. Anybody else missing that? Yeah. That day changed things for us forever in lots of different areas of our lives. But there was this instantly almost widespread but yet very short-lived kind of spiritual renewal. There were folks that hadn't for weeks or even months had much care or consideration about a conversation with God. Now all of a sudden a nation is brought to its knees. And accompanying the full churches on that following Sunday and the calls to prayer that crossed denominational lines was accompanying that was this incredible movement of our government to provide every way of protecting us that they possibly could. The next day, September the 12th, our commander-in-chief arrived at his office at 7 a.m. Stacked up on the desk there was a stack of phone messages that had been left by world leaders, literally from around the world, to express their condolences and their support of our nation during that incredibly dark and dismal day. It was a day that was pretty fast-paced and filled with a lot of travel and going from one place to the other and answering lots of questions. And it was towards the evening of September the 12th that President Bush had a press conference where he spoke these words. Reflecting on that night, this is what he said. "I was ready to make the declaration I had postponed the night before." Then he stood before those reporters and gave these words. "The deliberate and deadly attacks which were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror. They were acts of war." And so one day after the attacks of 9/11, our president declared war on terror. And 3 days later, the Congress supported that declaration as well. September the 11th was a time that caught us all by surprise. Not only us, but most all of the nations around the world were shocked. And yet, while it was a surprise to us, we know that there was a whole lot of scheming and planning that went into that day, months and probably years leading up to it. That it was strategically timed and placed with the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. And had it not been for those courageous folks on Flight 93, there would have been another plane going into the Capitol. Thank the Lord for those heroes who were among us. It was an attack on our ideology. It was an attack on our economy. It was an attack on our way of life. And even though there are folks out there that don't want us to talk about this element of it, I want to tell you that there was a spiritual aspect to that event of 9/11. That it is for real. There are folks out there, even still yet today, who would love nothing more than the demise and the destruction of the Christian faith. The good news is Christ won, and the good news is Christ wins. And he is and ever will be the victor, no matter how things may appear on any given day. It was an attack on our ideology, our spirituality, all that stuff, but you strip all that away, and at the base level, here's what it was. It was an attack by members of the human family upon members of the human family. That's what it was. It was a day that changed forever this generation. And I'm thinking of a generation, 2 generations before my own, when there was a day that radically changed life as they had known it. It wasn't a day in September, but it was a dismal, now in our storybooks, a dismal day in December. December the 7th, 1941, which Franklin Roosevelt said was a day that would live in infamy. The attacks that day came not in the form of Al-Qaeda terrorists, but those attacks came in the form of the Japanese Imperial Navy. For weeks leading up to that day, they had strategically positioned 6 different aircraft carriers that on December 7th came in 2 different waves, and they brought it. 353 different aircraft, fighters, bombers, ones that dropped torpedoes, and the destruction and devastation on Pearl Harbor that day was immense. There were 4 battleships that were sunk and 4 others that were severely damaged. They sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an aircraft training ship, 1 mine layer. 188 aircraft, United States aircraft, were destroyed. 2,402 people were killed and 1,282 folks were injured. It was a day that changed everything for that generation. 1 day later, President Roosevelt declared war on Japan and launched the United States right into World War II on both the Pacific and the European fronts. December 7, 1941 was a day that caught us by surprise. And it shocked our nation and many of the other nations around the world. But there was a plan that went into that. There was a scheme. It was strategically timed. And it was an attack on our ideology. It was an attack on our economy. And it was an attack on the whole notion of democracy. But you peel all that stuff away, and what it was an attack of some members of the human family against some other members of the human family. That's what it was. We backtrack not just 2 generations, but probably a couple hundred, and we find another story where brother was against brother. Actually, brothers were against brother. It's the story of Joseph, and we find it throughout Genesis. I tell you what, if you haven't read Genesis in a while, there are some great stories in Genesis. And the Joseph cycle is from Genesis 37 to Genesis 50, and it's a fantastic story filled with twists and turns and all kinds of just great stuff. But the situation in Genesis 37 was that Joseph's brothers had it up to here with Joseph. They were literally filled up and to overflowing with a jealous kind of rage against their brother. So they threw him down into a pit, and their intent was really to do him in. But one of the other brothers had some sense of compassion about him, and he said, let's not kill him. And it just so happened that there was this group of slave traders that were going by. Let's sell the boy and get some money for him. So the other brothers put their heads together and said, that would be a good idea. Let's just sell him. So they sold him. Then they took the robe that Daddy had given him. And if any of y'all go to the Roxy Theater, I think it is showing now Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, based on this story. These brothers take Joseph's Technicolor coat and they tear it to shreds, and they find some blood and dip it in the blood. Then they take it back to Daddy and say, we didn't see what happened, but this is the only thing that's left, knowing what the implication would be in the minds of their dad. The favored son is dead. Now, the key to keeping this whole thing together was that these brothers had to maintain the lie. All of them had to maintain it together. I mean, just one of them spoke a misspoken word, it would rat out everybody else. And I would imagine that the pressure to maintain the lie was pretty great, because after all, they'd just seen what could happen if all the rest of them ganged up on one and not I don't think any of the rest of them were saying, well, I would like to be the next to see what you all do to the one who gets out of line. It's a sad kind of story for Joseph, at least this part of it is, and it almost makes you feel sorry for him until you realize that Joseph didn't do himself any favors. He was the kind of guy who just didn't know when to shut up. When to just keep his yap shut. See, he would have things happen like a dream that would involve this image of the future where his brothers would literally be bowing down to him. That's a good time to just file it away, especially when you know they don't care for you too much anyway. Put it in the back of your mind. Bring it out later when you need it. He didn't need it this time. But he wakes up, oh man, I just had the best dream. You guys will never believe it. All of you were bowing down to me. And then there was the issue with the coat. Daddy gives him this beautiful coat of many colors, very expensive, unlike any gift that he had ever given to the rest of his sons. A smart Joseph would have realized, maybe I need to put that thing in the closet and break it out for special occasions. You know, weddings and family reunions and that kind of stuff. You know, something big and elaborate, but not Joseph. I can picture him parading that thing around like he was a peacock every day and then taking it to the dry cleaners every night to make sure it was looking sharp the next morning. And all that did was to fuel the fires of resentment that burned in the hearts of his brothers until they couldn't take it anymore. So they threw him in a pit. And they sold him as a slave. Joseph's story is intriguing, full of ups and downs. And just when you think he's on top of things, something happens to cut him back down. And one of the times in this series of the story of Joseph, he ends up in prison. And he would have never been there had his brothers not initially sold him into slavery. So I don't know about you, but if I'm in prison pining away, and I know that it's a direct result of what my brothers have done to me, I'm probably thinking of some very creative ways to get them back. And longing for the day when an opportunity is given to give them the smackdown way worse than what they gave it to me. Through a series of God-ordained events, Joseph arises from prison to a place of prominence in the Egyptian government. In fact, he comes all the way up to being second in command of the Pharaoh, and God speaks to Joseph. There's going to be a famine. The Pharaoh says, prepare the nation for the famine. So they have a few years where the harvest is plentiful. It's abundant. I mean, they got grain coming out their ears. It's everywhere. They build these big things to store them in, and bins and bigger barns, so that when the time of famine comes, not only is all of Egypt still eating pretty well, they have an abundance so that the other nations who are hungry can come to them and buy food. Well, sure enough, the nation that his brothers lived in were hit hard with the famine, and they were ill prepared for it, so they had nothing to eat. And as it would be, everybody who wanted something to eat that came from another nation, guess who they had to go to get it? Joseph. Great story. I mean, whoever was writing Genesis is putting it together so it leaves you hanging. If you've never read it before, you're like on the edge of your seat, because the brothers show up and he knows that it's them, but they don't know that it's him. And the first time that they come, he does not reveal his identity. And then they come back again later, and I'm here to tell you, when Joseph's brothers find out that Joseph is the one that they've been coming to, they get white as a sheet and scared as all get out, because they are certain that now there's a can about to get opened, and they're not wanting any of that. Because his brothers is in a great position to do everything that he needed to do, because they knew they were guilty. They sold him. They schemed. They planned. They put him in a pit. They got rid of him. They lied to their dad. They took his robe and they tore it up. They're the ones that dipped it in blood. They were guilty. And just when they expected the retaliation of their now very powerful brother,